The night of March 22nd, 1945. Oppenheim, Germany. Oberleutnant Klaus Becker crouches in a Wehrmacht observation post overlooking the Rhine, his binoculars scanning darkness that has suddenly gone quiet. For 6 hours, American artillery has pounded German positions with methodical fury. Now, at precisely 2200 hours, the bombardment stops. The silence feels more dangerous than the explosions. Then he sees them. Assault boats materializing from the mist like ghosts, dozens at first, then hundreds, carrying American infantry across Germany's last natural barrier without the massive artillery preparation that doctrine demands. No searchlights, no smoke screens, just silence and speed, and an operational tempo that violates everything Becker learned about amphibious warfare at the War Academy in Dresden. By dawn, 5,000 American soldiers have crossed the Rhine at Oppenheim without opposition. Within 48 hours, 4 entire divisions occupy the eastern bank. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. By the end of March, 60,000 vehicles will roll across pontoon bridges that Army engineers construct faster than any river crossing since Napoleon invaded Russia. Becker watches this mechanical river flowing east and understands what his superiors in Berlin refuse to acknowledge. Not because German soldiers have stopped fighting, but because American industrial capacity has rendered fighting meaningless. 3 years of total war have taught Wehrmacht officers to calculate the mathematics of defeat with brutal precision. Tank production numbers, artillery shell quantities, fuel consumption rates, each metric revealing how thoroughly Germany has lost the industrial competition that determines modern warfare's outcome. But the Rhine crossing demonstrates something beyond industrial advantage. It reveals a logistical sophistication that transforms raw material abundance into operational tempo no German commander can match. Patton's third. Army doesn't just cross the Rhine. It accelerates across it with a speed that makes the river crossing seem like a highway interchange rather than a strategic obstacle that has stopped armies for 2,000 years. The American trucks Becker counts through his binoculars that first night represent more than transportation capacity. They embody an engineering philosophy that has revolutionized military operations, while German planners clung to doctrines that worked brilliantly in 1940, but had become obsolete by 1945. One vehicle design in particular, the 2.5-ton GMC CCKW, the legendary Deuce and a Half, would move more supplies in 3 weeks than the entire Wehrmacht transported during 6 months of Operation Barbarossa. The story of how American logistics broke Germany's spine begins not with generals or strategy, but with engineers who understood that winning modern wars required moving millions of tons of supplies across hostile terrain faster than the enemy could destroy the vehicles carrying them. This is the story of how one truck design and one river crossing revealed to German scouts that their nation had been defeated not by superior tactics or braver soldiers, but by an industrial and logistical system they could never hope to match. The mahogany conference tables at General Motors' Detroit headquarters bore the weight of military contracts that would reshape global warfare. William S. Knudsen, the Danish immigrant who had risen to become GM's president, spread army procurement specifications across polished surfaces that had previously hosted discussions about civilian automobile production. The requirements seemed straightforward on paper. Army needed a 2.5-ton cargo truck capable of hauling supplies across European and Pacific battlefields that would destroy conventional vehicles within weeks. But the specifications concealed engineering challenges that would require rethinking fundamental assumptions about military transportation. The Army wanted all-wheel drive for traction on roads that ranged from Belgian highways to Burmese jungles. They demanded standardized components that front-line mechanics could repair without specialized tools or extensive training. Most critically, they required production volumes that exceeded anything American industry had ever attempted. By 1942, military planners understood that winning a two-front war against Germany and Japan meant moving supplies with efficiency that would make logistics as important as combat operations. Every infantry division required 500 tons of supplies daily. ammunition, fuel, food, medical equipment, replacement vehicles, spare parts, each category demanding transportation capacity that traditional military transport systems could never provide. The GMC CCKW emerged from this requirement with engineering simplicity that masked revolutionary capabilities. Its six-cylinder engine produced 91 horsepower, modest by contemporary standards, but reliable enough to operate for months without major maintenance. The 6x6 drive system, powering all six wheels simultaneously, provided traction that allowed the truck to climb grades and traverse mud that stopped conventional two-wheel drive vehicles. Its 5-speed transmission, combined with 2-speed transfer case, gave drivers 14 forward gears and 4 reverse gears, enabling precise control across terrain that ranged from mountain passes to beach sand. But the CCKW's most important innovation came from a design philosophy that prioritized maintainability over performance. Every major component, engine, transmission, axles, could be replaced by mechanics with basic tools and minimal training. Standardized parts meant that a broken fuel pump from one truck fit perfectly into any other CCKW, eliminating the supply chain nightmares that plagued armies relying on specialized vehicles requiring unique components. The windshield folded flat to reduce height for transport aboard ships. The cab could be removed entirely and replaced in under an hour if damaged by shrapnel or bullets. General Motors signed the initial production contract in April 1941, 8 months before Pearl Harbor brought America into the war. The company's manufacturing capacity, previously focused on Chevrolet sedans and Buick coupes, pivoted to military production with industrial efficiency that would astonish German intelligence analysts studying American war production figures. The Yellow Truck and Coach Manufacturing Division in Pontiac, Michigan, became the primary CCKW assembly facility, while additional plants in St. Louis and Oakland added production capacity as military orders expanded. By 1942, the assembly lines achieved industrial rhythm that produced one completed CCKW every 7 minutes. Workers, many of them women replacing men serving in combat units, mastered assembly procedures that integrated hundreds of components into functional vehicles that rolled off production lines ready for immediate military service. Quality control standards exceeded civilian automotive requirements, since failure in combat conditions meant death rather than inconvenience. Each truck underwent rigorous testing before acceptance by Army inspectors, who checked everything from tire pressure to brake function with military precision. The production numbers reflected America's industrial mobilization operating at wartime intensity. 1942 witnessed 50,000 units emerging from GM facilities. 1943 production accelerated to 120,000 vehicles. By 1944, as Allied forces prepared for D-Day, GM delivered 170,000 trucks that would form the backbone of European supply operations. The final tally reached 562,000 units, produced between 1941 and 1945, representing the largest procurement of standardized military trucks in history. Each vehicle cost $1,973, approximately $34,000 in contemporary purchasing power. The total program investment exceeded $19 billion in modern terms, making the CCKW program comparable to developing an entirely new weapons system. But unlike experimental technologies that often failed to deliver promised capabilities, the Deuce and a Half performed flawlessly across every theater where American forces operated, proving that simple, reliable engineering often mattered more than technological sophistication in determining battlefield outcomes. The trucks began arriving in European theater during 1943, accompanying forces landing in Sicily and Italy. Combat testing revealed capabilities that exceeded specifications in every measurable category. The CCKW operated successfully on roads that immobilized conventional vehicles, maintaining supply flow during conditions that traditionally suspended logistics operations. Their all-wheel drive handled soft sand and muddy terrain that stopped standard military trucks, while the simple mechanical design meant that frontline mechanics could maintain vehicles using basic tools and salvaged parts when formal supply systems broke down. The Red Ball Express, the legendary supply operation that sustained Allied forces racing across France after the Normandy breakout, depended entirely on CCKW trucks operated by predominantly African-American drivers, who maintained operational tempo that German forces could not interdict despite desperate attempts to cut supply lines. From August through November 1944, 6,000 trucks hauled 412,000 tons of supplies from Normandy beaches to frontline units advancing toward the German border. The statistics reflected not just material movement, but the logistical sophistication that allowed relatively small invasion forces to defeat larger German defensive armies through superior supply efficiency. By March 1945, as Allied forces approached the Rhine, the cumulative impact of American logistics had transformed the strategic balance in ways that went beyond counting divisions or tallying casualties. German forces defending the Western Front faced opponents who never ran out of ammunition, whose vehicles always had fuel, whose wounded soldiers received medical treatment that saved lives Wehrmacht field hospitals could no longer provide. The material disparity had reached levels that made tactical skill and operational brilliance irrelevant. Germany was being smothered by an industrial capacity that produced more of everything, faster and more reliably than German factories devastated by Allied bombing campaigns. The Rhine River represented Germany's last geographic barrier, the historic boundary that had protected Germanic tribes from Roman legions 2,000 years earlier. Military geography favored the defenders with advantages that any competent general could exploit. The river's width varied from 1,000 to 1,500 feet across the section where American forces would attempt their crossing. Its current flowed at speeds reaching 8 knots, swift enough to overwhelm conventional assault boats and drown soldiers whose equipment added 60 pounds to their body weight. The eastern bank rose in bluffs and hills that provided observation posts, where German artillery could destroy any bridgehead attempting to form. Wehrmacht defensive doctrine called for positioning the majority of forces at natural barriers, where geographic advantages multiplied defensive firepower. Every ton of supplies the Allies moved across the Rhine required engineering solutions that violated 2 centuries of military bridge-building practice. Traditional doctrine insisted on artillery preparation, lasting hours or days before assault forces. Attempted river crossings. Smoke screens would conceal troop movements from enemy observation. Engineers would construct pontoon bridges under cover of darkness, protected by infantry already holding the eastern shore. But by March 1945, German defensive positions along the Rhine existed primarily in planning documents rather than reality. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's desperate December counter-offensive through the Ardennes, had exhausted Germany's strategic reserve. The divisions defending the Western Front consisted increasingly of Volkssturm units, old men and teenage boys with minimal training and equipment that belonged in museums rather than modern warfare. German intelligence estimated 21 divisions positioned along the Rhine, but internal assessments acknowledged that most existed at half strength or less, with soldiers whose morale had collapsed after years of retreating from overwhelming Allied superiority. The contrast between German and American force structures revealed the mathematical reality of total war economics. Eisenhower commanded 4 million men organized into 5 army groups. Their supply lines stretched back to ports in France and Belgium, where cargo vessels unloaded equipment and materials that American factories produced with industrial efficiency no other nation could match. Every American infantry division fielded 34,000 men equipped with the latest weapons, supported by artillery that could fire more shells in 1 hour than an entire German corps possessed in reserve. Tank divisions rolled forward with Sherman and M26 Pershing tanks that, while inferior to German Panthers and Tigers in one-on-one duels, outnumbered German armor by ratios approaching 10-1. German forces defending the Rhine possessed nothing approaching this material abundance. Tank production had fallen to handfuls of vehicles per month, as Allied bombing destroyed factories and rail networks. Fuel shortages meant that panzers sat immobile in defensive positions, serving as expensive pillboxes rather than mobile strike forces. Artillery units rationed ammunition that factories could no longer produce in quantities adequate for sustained operations. The Wehrmacht's legendary tactical skill, so devastating during the opening years of war, had become a relic when applied against enemies whose material superiority rendered tactical brilliance meaningless. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, German supreme commander in the West, later compared leading German armies in 1945 to playing a Beethoven sonata on an old, rickety, out-of-tune piano. The metaphor captured both the frustration and the futility of commanding forces that lacked the basic resources necessary for modern warfare. German soldiers at the front recognized what their superiors in Berlin refused to acknowledge. They were fighting a losing battle, not because they lacked courage or skill, but because they faced an industrial and logistical system they could never hope to defeat through military means alone. The Americans brought to bear advantages that extended beyond simple numbers. Their air superiority had reached levels approaching absolute dominance. Republic P-47 Thunderbolts and North American P-51 Mustangs roamed German skies with impunity, attacking anything that moved in daylight hours. German forces learned to restrict movement to darkness, accepting massive operational constraints that reduced their ability to respond to Allied offensives. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of European skies, had been reduced to scattered units, flying jet-powered Me-262s and He-162s that posed threats mainly to Allied bombers but could not challenge the fighter bombers, providing close air support to ground forces. This combination of material abundance, logistical efficiency, and tactical flexibility had transformed American armies into military forces unlike anything seen in previous wars. They didn't just fight. They advanced with mechanical inexorability, rolling over obstacles that would have stopped earlier armies, maintaining operational tempo through supply systems that kept frontline units equipped, regardless of distance from base depots or intensity of combat operations. General George S. Patton understood this transformation better than most American commanders. His aggressive leadership style and controversial public statements masked a logistician's mind that grasped how modern warfare depended on supply lines as much as tactical brilliance. He had spent months studying the Rhine barrier, understanding that the river represented not just a military obstacle, but a psychological threshold. Crossing the Rhine meant entering the German heartland, transforming the war from territorial liberation into invasion of the Reich itself. The propaganda value alone justified extraordinary efforts. But Patton's motivations extended beyond strategic necessity, into personal rivalry with British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. Montgomery's carefully planned Operation Plunder, scheduled for March 23rd, would involve massive artillery bombardments, airborne assaults, and engineering operations that rivaled the Normandy invasion in complexity. Montgomery approached war with methodical thoroughness that minimized casualties, but sacrificed operational tempo. His Rhine crossing would be successful, but it would be slow, deliberate, and thoroughly British in its cautious professionalism. Patton intended to cross first, faster, and with American boldness that would steal Montgomery's thunder while proving that aggressive American tactics could achieve in hours what British caution required weeks to accomplish. His operational planning reflected this urgency. Rather than waiting for Montgomery's elaborate preparations, Patton would strike immediately after his forces reached the Rhine, crossing with whatever resources were available, without massive artillery preparation or elaborate deception operations. The approach violated military doctrine but aligned perfectly with Patton's understanding that in modern warfare, speed often mattered more than perfect preparation. The Third Army reached the Rhine near Oppenheim on March 21, 1945. Patton's advance had carried his forces 300 miles from the Ardennes battlefield in 3 months of sustained offensive operations that captured more territory and enemy prisoners than any comparable period of the war. The momentum seemed unstoppable, but the Rhine represented a barrier that mere aggressive spirit could not overcome. Crossing would require engineering expertise, specialized equipment, and logistical planning that transformed tactical success into strategic breakthrough. Patton selected Major General Stafford Leroy Irwin's 5th Infantry Division to spearhead the assault. The Red Diamond Division had distinguished itself throughout the European campaign, crossing so many rivers that Patton later joked they must have developed webbed feet. They were veterans who understood river-crossing operations through brutal experience earned at the Sauer, the Moselle, and a dozen smaller waterways that dotted the German landscape. Their expertise would prove essential for an operation that required executing complex maneuvers under conditions that left no room for error or hesitation. The timing reflected Patton's competitive nature and his understanding of psychological warfare's importance. Crossing on the night of March 22nd, one day before Montgomery's massive Operation Plunder, would demonstrate American boldness while undermining British claims to be leading the Allied advance into Germany. But the decision also carried genuine tactical logic. German defences at Oppenheim were weaker than at sites farther north where Montgomery planned his assault. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Intelligence indicated minimal enemy presence, suggesting that a swift, silent crossing might achieve complete surprise. The assault boats materialized on transport trucks that had traveled from supply depots in Lorraine, where engineers had stockpiled bridging equipment and river-crossing materials since autumn. Patton's logistical foresight, often overshadowed by his theatrical personality, had positioned supplies forward in anticipation of exactly this opportunity. While other commanders waited for formal orders before requesting specialized equipment, Patton's staff had been pre-positioning resources for months, understanding that in mobile warfare, the army that moved fastest often won simply by arriving before the enemy could organize defenses. 2200 hours, March 22nd. The 5th Division's assault companies climbed into canvas and plywood boats that weighed 240 pounds empty, but would carry 12 fully equipped infantrymen across 900 feet of fast-flowing water. No artillery preparation announced the plylos. Attack. No searchlights illuminated the eastern shore. Patton had ordered complete tactical surprise, gambling that stealth would prove more valuable than suppressing fire that would alert every German unit within 10 miles that Americans were crossing the Rhine. Private Tom Tucker, one of the first soldiers to climb into an assault boat that night, later recalled his surprise at how well prepared everything seemed. His unit had been spearheading the advance toward the river, expecting a pause to organize for the crossing. Instead, they found rows of trucks filled with assault boats, bridging equipment, and engineers who had been planning this operation for weeks, while the infantry focused on reaching the Rhine. The preparation revealed logistical sophistication that separated American operations from German improvisations, increasingly characterized by shortages and desperate expedients. The boats entered the water silently, pushed by soldiers wading into March-cold current that soaked boots and uniforms within seconds. Oars replaced outboard motors to maintain silence, 12 men rowing in synchronized rhythm while praying that German machine gunners hadn't spotted dark shapes moving across moonlit water. The crossing took 8 minutes, long enough for soldiers to contemplate mortality while calculating odds that seemed to improve with every stroke that brought them closer to the eastern shore. They hit the German bank without encountering resistance. No artillery fire, no machine gun fire, no flares illuminating targets for defenders who weren't there. The 5th Division established its bridgehead without firing a shot, occupying German positions that had been abandoned hours earlier. As Wehrmacht units withdrew eastward toward defensive lines, they could actually hold with forces that existed in reality rather than planning documents. Within an hour, an entire regiment occupied the eastern shore. By dawn, 5,000 American soldiers held positions that German counterattacks would never dislodge. Oberleutnant Klaus Becker, watching from his observation post 3 miles north, understood immediately what the silent crossing meant. This wasn't a raid or reconnaissance in force. This was the beginning of the end, executed with operational tempo that made German defensive doctrine obsolete. He reached for the field telephone, connecting him to division headquarters, knowing his report would confirm what every intelligent German officer already understood. The Rhine barrier had been breached, not through massive assault, but through American logistics and tactical speed that rendered static defenses meaningless. The engineer battalions followed within hours, bringing with them the equipment that would transform tactical success into strategic breakthrough. The 249th Engineer Combat Battalion arrived at the Western Shore carrying pontoon bridge sections that weighed thousands of pounds and required precise coordination to assemble into structures capable of supporting tank traffic. Lieutenant Colonel John K. Addison commanded the battalion with engineering expertise earned through dozens of river crossings across France and Germany. His mission was straightforward in concept but brutally difficult in execution. Construct a pontoon bridge capable of handling 5-ton vehicles before German artillery could range in on the crossing site. The bridge construction began at midnight on March 23rd, just hours after the infantry assault had secured the eastern shore. Engineers worked under blackout conditions that made every task twice as difficult and infinitely more dangerous. Pontoon sections had to be positioned precisely, connected with mechanical joints that required alignment measured in fractions of inches, then anchored against current that exerted thousands of pounds of force against every segment. One mistake, one misaligned joint or improperly secured anchor, and the entire structure would collapse into the Rhine, drowning engineers and destroying equipment that couldn't be replaced on the German battlefield. The mathematical precision required to construct floating bridges across swiftly flowing rivers had been mastered by Army engineers through years of practice and engineering innovation that dated back to World War I. Each pontoon section supported specific loads distributed across carefully calculated areas. The bridge sections connected through mechanical joints that allowed movement, while maintaining structural integrity strong enough to handle Sherman tanks weighing 33 tons fully loaded. Anchoring systems used hydraulic principles to develop holding power that exceeded the weight of individual anchors by factors approaching 10 to 1. At 0430 hours on March 23rd, 18 hours after construction began, the first truck crossed the completed pontoon bridge at Nierstein. The 366-metre floating span represented remarkable engineering, accomplishment that undoubtedly contributed to shortening the war by enabling rapid exploitation that prevented German forces from establishing defensive lines farther east. Colonel Addison's battalion had achieved what Napoleon's engineers required days to accomplish, proving that American engineering capability matched or exceeded any military force in history. But the single bridge at Nierstein, while tactically significant, could not handle the volume of traffic required to sustain offensive operations deep into Germany. Patton's Third Army included 12 divisions totaling over 320,000 men, 4,000 tanks and artillery pieces, and 60,000 support vehicles that needed to cross the Rhine before German forces could mount effective counterattacks. One bridge meant traffic jams that would stretch for miles, presenting targets that German artillery and aircraft could attack with devastating effectiveness. Additional engineer battalions arrived with equipment for multiple bridges at locations selected through careful analysis of river conditions, enemy positions, and road networks on the eastern shore. At Oppenheim, the 1,135th Engineer Combat Group supervised construction of a second major bridge. At Boppard and Oberleutnant, engineer companies built crossing sites that allowed simultaneous operations, reducing bottlenecks that could have strangled the advance. Within 5 days of the initial assault, 6 permanent pontoon bridges spanned the Rhine at Third Army crossing sites, each handling steady streams of vehicles moving east with mechanical efficiency that German observers found incomprehensible. The trucks crossing these bridges represented the culmination of American industrial mobilization concentrated into transportation form. GMC CCKWs rolled across pontoon spans loaded with 5,000 pounds of ammunition, fuel, medical supplies, and equipment that sustained offensive operations, advancing 50 miles per day. Their 6-wheel drive handled muddy approach roads softened by March rains and the passage of thousands of vehicles. Their simple mechanical design meant that maintenance crews could keep them running despite the crushing workload imposed by sustained combat operations. The crossing statistics revealed logistical capabilities that exceeded anything achieved in previous military operations. In the first week after March 22nd, 60,000 vehicles crossed Third Army bridges, representing more equipment than entire German army groups possessed at this stage of the war. The tonnage figures reflected not just material movement, but the operational tempo that allowed Patton's forces to exploit the Rhine breakthrough before German resistance could solidify. By March 31st, 9 days after the initial crossing, Third Army had captured 300,000 German prisoners, while advancing 100 miles into the German interior. These numbers told a story that transcended mere military statistics. They revealed the complete breakdown of German defensive capabilities in the face of American logistical superiority. German units attempting to organize counterattacks found themselves outflanked before they could concentrate forces, overwhelmed by artillery fire they couldn't answer, and cut off by American armor that moved faster than Wehrmacht staff officers could track on situation maps. The Rhine crossing had demonstrated not just tactical boldness, but the transformation of modern warfare into a logistical competition that Germany had lost years earlier, but only now faced consequences of that defeat with devastating clarity. German scouts observing from the eastern heights watched this mechanical river with emotions ranging from resignation to disbelief. Oberleutnant Becker, still manning his observation post despite orders to withdraw, counted vehicles crossing pontoon bridges with methodical precision. His reports to division headquarters provided statistical confirmation of what German commanders already understood. The Americans possessed material resources that rendered continued resistance militarily meaningless. Every hour brought more tanks, more trucks, more artillery pieces rolling across the Rhine and deploying into attack formations that no German force could hope to stop. The psychological impact of witnessing American logistics in action proved as devastating as the material disparity itself. German soldiers, who had fought courageously through years of war, found themselves questioning the purpose of continued sacrifice when the outcome seemed predetermined by industrial factors beyond any soldier's control. The trucks represented more than transportation. They embodied an economic and industrial system that had outproduced, outorganized, and ultimately overwhelmed a German war machine that had terrorized Europe for 4 years. The contrast between American and German logistics revealed fundamental differences in how the two nations approached warfare. German doctrine emphasized tactical excellence and operational brilliance, training officers who could execute complex maneuvers with forces that maximized combat effectiveness through superior tactics and soldier quality. This approach had worked brilliantly during the early war years, when German advantages in training and equipment overcame numerical inferiority. But by 1945, tactical skill could not compensate for material shortages that left German units without fuel, ammunition, and replacement equipment necessary for sustained operations. American doctrine accepted that individual tactical engagements might not favor U.S. forces, but emphasized logistical superiority that ensured American units never ran out of supplies, while German forces increasingly operated on razor-thin margins, where one disrupted supply convoy could paralyze entire divisions. The Americans built redundancy into every logistical system, maintaining supply, flows through multiple routes that enemy interdiction could damage but never completely sever. German logistics, by contrast, depended on rail networks that Allied bombing had systematically destroyed and truck transport that lacked both vehicles and fuel necessary for the sustained operations modern warfare demanded. The deuce-and-a-half trucks rolling across Rhine bridges represented this philosophical difference concentrated into mechanical form. They weren't sophisticated weapons systems requiring specialized training and maintenance. They were simple, reliable vehicles that functioned despite abuse, damage, and operating conditions that would have destroyed more complex equipment. This design philosophy, prioritizing reliability over performance, maintainability over sophistication, had created a logistical system that worked consistently under the chaos of combat operations, where German supply systems increasingly failed. Joseph Goebbels, Nazi propaganda minister, recognized the Rhine crossing's significance in diary entries that revealed the regime's desperate situation. On March 24th, he wrote that the situation in the West had entered an extraordinarily critical, ostensibly almost deadly, phase. He noted the crossing of the Rhine on a broad front and foresaw Allied attempts to encircle the Ruhr industrial heartland. These private admissions contrasted sharply with public propaganda that continued promising final victory through miracle weapons and fanatical resistance. But even Goebbels couldn't conceal from himself the mathematical reality that American logistics had rendered German resistance futile. Adolf Hitler, confined to his underground bunker in Berlin, received reports of the Rhine crossings with rage that bordered on madness. He ordered immediate counterattacks to destroy the Allied bridgeheads, demanding that Wehrmacht commanders commit reserves that existed only in his delusional imagination. Division staff officers tasked with executing these impossible orders could only report that no forces were available for offensive operations. The strategic reserve had been consumed in the Ardennes offensive. The divisions defending the Western Front lacked fuel to move their remaining tanks and ammunition to sustain more than a few hours of combat. Hitler's orders might as well have demanded that his armies sprout wings and fly. Field Marshal Kesselring, the pragmatic commander who understood military reality despite Nazi ideology's demands, recognized that the Rhine crossings had sealed Germany's fate. His forces could still fight, still inflict casualties on advancing Americans, still delay the inevitable conclusion. But they could not stop what was coming. American logistics had created a military steamroller that would flatten German resistance through sheer material weight. Every hour brought more supplies across those pontoon bridges. Every day saw American spearheads advance deeper into territory that German forces lacked the resources to defend. The Ruhr pocket, Germany's industrial heartland, fell to encirclement within 2 weeks of the Rhine crossing. Model's Army Group B, considered one of the Wehrmacht's most effective formations, found itself trapped by American forces, advancing faster than German commanders thought possible. The encirclement demonstrated how completely American mobility had revolutionized warfare. German units attempting to escape the pocket discovered that every road had been cut, every escape route blocked by American armor that had outmaneuvered forces that once set the standard for mobile warfare. By April 14th, with the pocket torn in two and German units running out of ammunition and food, mass surrenders began. The 116th Panzer Division, legendary throughout the war, had neither a single serviceable tank nor an artillery round left to its name. Thousands, then tens of thousands of German soldiers responded to American loudspeaker calls to surrender, or simply made for the nearest U.S. unit, with white flags or handkerchiefs in hand. The men of the Wehrmacht could see no reason to carry on an unequal struggle. "What's the point in this?" one soldier asked. "I have a wife and children." The number of prisoners exceeded all expectations, amounting to 317,000 men, twice what American intelligence had estimated. The human herd rolled into POW cages that were little more than open fields, Rhine meadow camps that stretched as far as the eye could see. The prisoners represented the final collapse of German military power in the West, the complete breakdown of forces that had conquered most of Europe just 4 years earlier. They were defeated not through lack of courage or tactical skill, but through industrial and logistical inadequacies that no amount of military professionalism could overcome. American logistics continued flowing east with mechanical inevitability that crushed remaining German resistance through sheer volume rather than tactical brilliance. The deuce-and-a-half trucks that had crossed the Rhine in those first chaotic days now ranged across southern Germany, Austria, and into Czechoslovakia, carrying supplies that sustained offensive operations, advancing 50 to 100 miles per week. By late April, Patton's Third Army had liberated Ohrdruf, a subcamp of Buchenwald, exposing Nazi concentration camps to American soldiers whose previous combat experience had not prepared them for industrialized genocide. The discoveries at Ohrdruf, followed by similar horrors at Flossenbürg, Dachau, and Mauthausen, provided moral vindication for the war effort while revealing the complete depravity of the regime that American logistics had helped destroy. General Eisenhower insisted that frontline troops tour the camps, ensuring that soldiers understood what they had been fighting against. The psychological impact proved profound, hardening American resolve while making clear that defeating Nazi Germany represented not just military necessity but moral imperative. May 8, 1945, brought German surrender documents signed in a schoolhouse in Reims, France, ending the European war that had consumed 6 years and 60 million lives. The final logistics tallies revealed numbers that military historians would study for decades. American forces had moved 15,750,000 tons of supplies across the Rhine in the war's final months, sustaining offensive operations that covered more territory in less time than any comparable military campaign in history. The Rhine crossing had enabled this strategic mobility, transforming tactical success into operational breakthrough that prevented German forces from establishing defensive lines that might have prolonged the war by months. The deuce-and-a-half trucks that German scouts had watched crossing Rhine bridges in those first nights represented 1/3 of everything that enabled Allied victory in Europe. From individual rifle cartridges to complete Sherman tanks, 550,000 tons of supplies had travelled through the Rhine crossing sites aboard vehicles that rarely received recognition in historical accounts focused on generals and battles. Yet without those trucks, without the logistical sophistication they embodied, the tactical and operational brilliance would have been meaningless. The German scouts who observed American logistics during those critical weeks carried their memories into a post-war era that would be shaped by the lessons learned through defeat. Becker, surviving the war's final chaotic weeks, later reflected on what the Rhine crossing had revealed. The Americans hadn't won through superior tactics or braver soldiers. They won through industrial capacity and logistical organization that transformed material abundance into military victory. The trucks represented not just transportation, but an entire philosophy of warfare that Germany had failed to match despite years of total mobilization. The lesson embedded in the Rhine crossing extended beyond World War II to fundamental questions about how modern nations wage war. Material resources mattered more than tactical skill when disparities reached levels that made tactical excellence irrelevant. Logistical sophistication determined whether armies could sustain operations beyond their initial attacks, transforming battlefield victories into strategic triumphs that achieved political objectives. The deuce-and-a-half trucks, simple mechanical devices requiring no particular innovation or technological sophistication, had proven more strategically important than Tiger tanks or Me-262 jets precisely because they worked consistently under conditions where sophisticated equipment failed. The Rhine crossing demonstrated that winning modern wars required not just brave soldiers or brilliant generals, but industrial systems capable of producing, transporting, and maintaining the supplies necessary for sustained operations across hundreds of miles of hostile territory. Germany had possessed the world's most tactically proficient army in 1940, but tactical proficiency proved inadequate against opponents whose material resources could overwhelm skill through sheer abundance. The Americans had built an army that accepted tactical setbacks, absorbed casualty numbers that would have broken smaller forces, and kept advancing because their logistics ensured that ammunition never ran out, fuel always flowed forward, and broken equipment could be replaced from seemingly limitless reserves. The German scouts who watched 10,000 American trucks cross the Rhine in those first nights understood what their superiors in Berlin refused to acknowledge until Soviet shells were falling on Hitler's bunker. The war was over not because German soldiers stopped fighting, but because they faced an industrial and logistical system they could never hope to defeat through military means alone. The trucks represented more than transportation. They embodied America's transformation from industrial giant to military superpower, demonstrating how economic capacity could be converted into military force that reshaped global political order. Patton, celebrating the Rhine crossing with his characteristic theatrical flair, stopped his jeep on the pontoon bridge to urinate into the river, telling those around him that he had been looking forward to this for a long time. The gesture, photographed and widely publicized, captured both his personality and the moment's significance. The Rhine, historic barrier that had protected Germanic peoples for 2 millennia, had been reduced to a urinal for American generals whose armies possessed resources that ancient legions could never have imagined. The crude symbolism reflected military reality. Germany had been defeated by an opponent whose industrial capacity rendered traditional military calculations obsolete. Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson, receiving news of the crossing in Washington, captured American sentiment with undiplomatic bluntness. "We gave Montgomery everything he asked for, paratroopers, assault boats, and even the Navy, and by God, Patton has crossed the Rhine." The statement revealed American pride in outperforming British methodical caution through aggressive action that violated military doctrine, but achieved results that vindicated the approach. But beneath the competitive boasting lay recognition that American success depended on logistical capabilities that no other nation, Allied or Axis, could match. The GMC-CCKW continued serving American forces through the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and into the 1980s, proving that simple, reliable engineering could remain relevant across 4 decades of technological change. The trucks that crossed the Rhine in March 1945 became training vehicles for Cold War mechanics, cargo haulers in Southeast Asian jungles, and eventually museum pieces representing America's greatest generation. Their longevity validated the design philosophy that prioritized reliability over sophistication, demonstrating that in military logistics, simple solutions that worked consistently often proved more valuable than complex systems offering marginal performance improvements. The legacy of the Rhine crossing extended beyond military history into fundamental questions about how industrial societies wage war. The German scouts who observed American logistics in action carried lessons that shaped post-war military thinking about the relationship between industrial capacity and military power. No amount of tactical skill could compensate for material shortages that left armies unable to sustain operations. Logistical sophistication determined whether battlefield victories translated into strategic success. The simple truck, easily dismissed as unglamorous support equipment, had proven more strategically important than any weapon system in determining warfare's ultimate outcomes. The Rhine bridges themselves, dismantled and removed within weeks of Germany's surrender, left no physical trace of the engineering achievement that had enabled Allied victory. But the operational lessons persisted, studied by military planners who understood that the crossing represented more than tactical success. It demonstrated how logistical preparation, engineering expertise, and industrial capacity combined to create military capabilities that overwhelmed opponents, regardless of their tactical proficiency. The Americans had proven that modern warfare rewarded nations that could organize, produce, and sustain, rather than those that merely fought skillfully. The German scouts who watched those first trucks rolling east across Rhine bridges understood that they were witnessing the end of their nation's military power, not because German soldiers lacked courage or commitment, but because they faced opponents whose resources rendered continued resistance futile. The trucks kept coming, an endless mechanical river flowing east with supplies that American factories produced faster than German forces could destroy them. It was over, not in the dramatic collapse of battlefield defeat, but in the quiet recognition that industrial mathematics had determined the outcome years before the final battles were fought. The lesson remained valid 8 decades later. Wars between industrial powers would be determined not primarily by tactics or generalship, but by capacity to produce, transport, and sustain military forces across extended campaigns that tested logistics as severely as they tested combat capabilities. The Rhine crossing stood as testament to this reality, a moment when American industrial might transformed into military force that ended history's most destructive war through logistical superiority that no opponent could match. Thank you for watching. For more detailed, historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.